I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
United States of America,
and to the republic
for
which
which
it
it
stands,
stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with liberty and justice
for all.
for all.
For all. Very good.
All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our virtual presentation. Steve Levy is our guest speaker, and the topic will be pension and overtime time bomb. During the presentation, I will mute everybody. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, or on the menu bar, you can click on something to say raise your hand. We'll be watching. And you get to ask your questions verbally. We're going to ask that you only ask one question at a time to give everybody enough time to introduce their questions or subjects for the speaker. So with that, I'm going to introduce Steve Levy.
Oh, thank you, Fred, John, and all. And it's great to see so many of you, at least in a virtual fashion. As Lenore was saying, as a prelude to this, that we really missed human interaction that was so common prior to March. But this will have to do for the moment, and look forward to catching up with you again back on the circuit when we get back to some normalcy. Hopefully. You know, when I was first called to
Steve, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Sorry.
Someone unmuted Steve.
I've been muted for all that time?
No, just for the last 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. I didn't press a thing, so I don't know how that happened. But I was saying I was first asked to come to the LIASB meeting back in February for July, figuring, oh, that's plenty of time to prep, and who knows what can happen in between. Well, the world has turned upside down since. And it's kind of appropriate to have this discussion on pensions and overtime and the impact it's having on making our budgets unsustainable. And then wham, we get hit with this pandemic in between that has turned budgets on the school level, town level, county level, state level, upside down. And, you know, we're in a crisis mode. And in a way, it's possible that the crisis that we're now facing can finally have elected officials and the public focus on some of these root problems that were making our budgets implode even before we got to the pandemic. So if we never had coronavirus, we were heading off of a cliff, folks. It was happening. It was just a matter of time. And as I've always said, before you can solve a problem, you first have to be able to comprehend what the cause of that problem is. So many things have happened in between. We had an article just yesterday, 2 days ago in the New York Post, where a writer for the Manhattan Institute, Steve Malanga, talked about all of this focus on defund the police and readdressing the monies that go to the police department. He said, the focus is really wrong. Look, I want more police. Most normal people want more police. The way you get more police is to weed out the inefficiencies that are presently embedded in the system. Why are there these inefficiencies? And it comes back to these benefits and the pension time bomb that is the focus of this lecture here today. To start off, I've got a stat for you. It goes to the amount of money that local governments contribute to pensions. So you have an employee that you hire, let's say for $100,000. The county's not on the hook just for $100,000. You've got to pay $20,000 at least in health benefits for that individual and their family. Then you've got to contribute into the pension system. For police officers, it could be about 25%. So it could be another 20, 25 grand that county taxpayers put into the pension fund to help fund the pensions for all of the retirees and the future retirees. Now listen to this stat. Back in 2000, the state, the towns, the schools, the counties, they were putting in about $165 million into that fund. That's $165 million with an M. By 2017, that $165 million rose to $4.8 billion. $165 million to $4.8 billion. If you want to do some quick math, that's an increase of 2,900%. All right. I can tell you the cost of living might have gone up, but not like that. Totally out of control. So you've got, your inflation going along the route of 1 or 2% a year during this time, maybe 3%, but I don't even ever think it's reached that. And you've got this pension time bomb exploding by 3,000% over a 17-year period. And the question is, number one, why? And number two, what do we do about it? Well, we can go to the first slide here. One of the reasons is that overtime is being baked in to these accounts. This isn't on the slide here, but we all heard about that MTA, that Long Island Railroad employee that was on the front page of Newsday. It made a great deal of noise, and thank goodness. This is a fella who had, a base salary, maybe 100 grand or so. He earned $344,000 in 1 year on overtime, bulked up his salary for that year to 460 grand, which allowed him to retire with a $162,000 pension. Way more money than your average New Yorker will ever earn in 1 year throughout their entire lifetime. This is crazy stuff, and it's allowed to happen. So if you look at the PowerPoint here, the pensions are based in the public sector on usually your last 3 years. It's the highest, it's the 3 highest years of service, and they're usually the last 3 years, okay? But they're not limited to just your base pay. Overtime is allowed to be factored in. So what happens is there's a wink and a nod within all of these systems where, all right, Joe, you're about to retire, load up on the overtime in those last couple of years. Now, in fact, some of the contracts, including a police contract, actually gives preference to those more senior members. So they get first crack at the overtime. So you can take $100,000 salary, and some guys might make 100 grand in overtime. The average in Nassau was $37,000 during a 1 year period. But if you're like in your last couple of years, you're going to make it even higher than that. So you can then take 50 to 60% of that, and that's how much it's going to inflate your pension. I would say that when you retire, let's say it's a $100,000 pension, a $100,000 salary, depending on how long you serve, you'll get either 50 or 60% of that, more likely 60 and above, as your pension, $60,000 a year. Now, if you're disabled, which don't kid yourself, many firefighters in New York City and police officers throughout the entire state go out on disability, then you get 75% of your final earnings. And remember, they're all tax-free on the state level. So you actually make more money when you're disabled than if you go to work. We can go to the next slide, Robert, please. Okay. So in 2010, we had the Great Recession. And David Paterson was the governor at the time, and people were saying, look, this is out of control. In fact, there was a New York Times article that really started to expose this. They looked at the city of Yonkers, where the overtime was so out of control. You had 100 employees in Yonkers who were making more money retired than when what their salary was when they were working. Say, how can that be? Well, you got a $100,000 salary. Now out here in Suffolk, detectives making $225,000, $250,000 a year. But let's just use round number $100,000. If you double that with your overtime, your pension is going to be more than what you were making for your $100,000. It's simply unsustainable. So Patterson and some of the legislators said, let's try to get control over this. So they passed what's called Tier 6. And they said for any new incoming employees as of April of 2012, you will be limited as to how much overtime you can factor in to your pension. And they washed their hands and they said, we're done. We solved the problem, and they walked away. Here's the problem. It only applied to those employees who were hired after April 12th. Well, 2/3 of your future retirees are present employees who were there before April 12th. So those changes don't apply to them. So for the next 20 years or so, you're going to continue to see employees retiring and taking all of that overtime and walking away with it. And you'll say, oh, well, we'll get some reprieve 20 years from now when those people hired in April 2012 retire. Well, I hope we're still in business by then, because you've got a lot of folks who are retiring now with these astronomical pensions. In fact, according to the Manhattan Institute, in 2017, there were 5,000 employees, retirees in the state of New York, this is public retirees, who were making over $100,000 a year on their pension, and 20 were making over $200,000 on their pension. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So we can basically factor out, and that's what our center did. My Center for Cost-Effective Government is a not-for-profit think tank. And we said, let's give the people of New York State an idea of just how humongous this obligation is, okay? So we started off with these different unions, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's people who work for the state of New York, the state government, and other towns that they're part of the New York State early retirement, the New York State employee retirement system. Then you have a separate one for New York City Police, New York City Fire. You have police and fire outside of New York City. So, and then you have New York City non-uniformed officer employees. The sanitation guys have their own. The Port Authority have their own. The Long Island Railroad have their own. So you have this hodgepodge of all these different unions, but the provisions are pretty close to the same with most of them. So what we did is we said this, let's look at what is a typical retiring class in the Nassau Police Department, for instance. And we say, okay, it's 400 people. And what is the average overtime that a person near retirement is earning? Okay, it's $37,000. So you can very easily extrapolate from that over the next 20 years, there's going to be 400 retirees per year. And conservatively, we will say that they'll retire with that $37,000 in extra overtime. Now, that's obviously going to go up with inflation over the years, but let's just do it conservative. So you just multiply that out and you can find out, here's how much overtime will impact taxpayers in that 1 year for that one class. Then you have to realize that that one class is going to be receiving that money 20, 25 years for their lifespan. If some of these guys and gals are retiring in their 40s, because it's still only 20 years and then you can retire out in law enforcement, most law enforcement, and 25 years in some of these other unions, you're retiring, let's say 50 years old. Life expectancy is out till 80. So that individual is going to be earning this pension for 30 years on average. That's a lot of money. And we calculate it and we come up with the figure that, they're pretty remarkable numbers. For the New York State Employee Retirement System, that's $14 billion over 20 years and $21.8 billion over 25 years. We can go to the next slide, Rob, please. And here you can see how we broke it down. 35,000 police officers and firefighters outside of New York City. It's going to cost $5 billion for 20 years, almost $8 billion for 25. New York City police officers, it'll be about $4.1 billion over 25 years. But if you use the 37,000 average retirement, overtime near retirement, it comes out to about $10 billion over the 25 years. And that's an important stat because that fellow Steve Malanga, who had his article in the Post, said, we're all focusing on defunding cops and, what the story is with the police departments. No one's focusing on this. If we could solve this problem, we could put far more cops out on the street and still have more money in our own pockets. New York City firefighters, okay, we found that it would be about $1.6 billion over 25 years. We can go to the next one. Correction officers, again, $4.8 billion over 25 years. We found that the overtime amounts for the correction officers and the Port Authority were the highest. The Port Authority, in some cases, you had the employees about to retire averaging $56,000 a year in overtime. So you look at these guys, they might be your next door neighbors. They're going in to work at the Port Authority or the MTA or the Long Island Railroad. And you're thinking, their salaries, their base salaries are not that high. So how are they getting these six-figure pensions? It's all about the overtime that's being baked in. We can go to the next. Okay, so now we look at the Consumer Price Index. In the 20 years, over the last 20 years, there was a 54% increase in the CPI, a 73% increase over 25 years. So let's say, again, conservatively, we'll pretty much mirror that going out the next 20 or 25 years. And by the way, the last 20, 25 years were extraordinarily low levels of inflation. But we'll conservatively say that it'll stay low going out 20, 25 years. By doing that, we can extrapolate, and we go to the next slide. We could take all those numbers that we saw, and when you adjust it for inflation, it really goes off the charts. Okay, the New York State Employee Retirement System, once the overtime gets factored in, goes to like $40 billion, $38 billion over 20 years, and $66 billion over 25 years. And then you see the impact of inflation on police and fire and the New York City police. We can go to the next slide. The long story short is that there's going to be, we can go one more from there. It's going to be a total of about $83 billion with overtime being factored in when you add in inflation over the next 25 years. Now, put this into perspective. The MTA was collapsing, and they're saying we have to come up with a $50 billion capital program for the MTA to keep the trains running on time and the buses running on time. That entire capital project is dwarfed by just the amount that we will have to pay for an increase in pensions due to overtime. Now, when I say $84 billion over the next 25 years, that's not your pension obligation as a taxpayer. That's just the increase to the taxpayer burden because overtime will be factored in. So let's put this another way, very simplistically. If you want to find a very quick way to save $84 billion over the next 25 years by snapping your fingers and doing nothing else, just pass a law tomorrow or today, better yet, that says overtime will no longer be factored into pensions. Simple as that. That's all we have to do. Easier said than done, because we know how strong the unions are and we know how weak so many of our elected officials are, present company excluded, with one of our champions, Assemblyman Mike Fitzpatrick, who's on this call. So let's go to the next. Okay. We mentioned Tier 6 a little bit earlier. Tier 6, again, only applies to those employees who were hired after April of 2012. What do you do about all those other employees? We need to fix the system that, hey, for those, and by the way, there's 600,000 of those employees, 600,000. We have to pass the law now that says, hey, you can't have the overtime factored in to your pensions as well. We can't wait 20 years down the line for this. Now, it gets complicated because people will say, well, New York State has a very restrictive constitution, and that's true. In other states, you can make that change rather easily. In New York, the unions really loaded up on the Constitution to protect themselves, and there's a provision in it that says, matters related to a pension shall not be diminished or impaired. So what does that mean? That's subject to judicial interpretation, right? We all understand that we just can't go in there and tell present employees who are in a defined benefit pension, which means they get a guaranteed pension. We can't convert them to a defined contribution system, which means you now have a typical private sector IRA that goes up and down with the market and no more guarantees. We can do that with future employees, but not present employees unless we change the Constitution. But how does it work when you're just talking about overtime? Not the basic nuts and bolts of the pension, but these fringes. Can you change it with mere legislation? I think it's very sketchy, and different professors and interpreters of the Constitution and case law will tell you different things. But that's why Mike Fitzpatrick, at the urging of our center, is putting in the bill to say, erase all doubt. Get a constitutional amendment in the state of New York to say that overtime can no longer be factored in for any employee, 2012 or before. That's really needed. You say, oh, well, we can't get a constitutional amendment. Baloney. We just passed one for gambling a couple of years ago. They'll probably put one up for marijuana. We've done it for removing pensions from people. It's done all the time. We can do this if there's the will to do it. Now, what's another option? Chapter 9, bankruptcy. Now, Mitch McConnell, just a couple of months ago, got into a lot of hot water when he said, well, instead of us just having, bailing out blue states for their irresponsible budgeting, let them go bankrupt. And a lot of people scoffed at that. Wow, how cruel are you? That's crazy. It's great. It's not so crazy. Let me tell you, bankruptcy and having control boards can be a savings grace here. Look, we all know when a company goes bankrupt, they don't necessarily go out of business. What is bankruptcy? It's a restructuring of that organization. Wouldn't it be great if we had a restructuring of our government? So many of these awful provisions that are embedded within these contracts are there to stay unless we do something pretty substantial in changing it. We know the elected officials don't have the backbone to do it, so put them into bankruptcy and let a judge do it. It's not so far-fetched. Detroit went bankrupt. and they restructured their debt. San Bernardino in California, Stockton, it happens all the time where these municipalities will go bankrupt. Let it happen. It gives you the opportunity to make change. I'll give you another example. Since it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Newsday, you might have seen it, front cover on a Sunday edition, $2.1 billion obligation that taxpayers in New York have for public employees cashing out their sick days. So you guys in the private sector are saying, what are you talking about? Cashing out a sick day? If I get a sick day, I use it or I lose it. Not in the government. You bank it if you don't use it. You say, big deal. Well, if you look at the police budgets, they get 26 sick days a year. If they bank them starting in their rookie year, you'll have hundreds and multiple hundreds of these days. When you retire, you don't retire based upon the salary of your rookie year when you took that sick day. All of them are paid out based upon your salary when you're retiring, which might be $200,000 a year, which is why you have so many of these employees saying bye to the government, say, give me my check for $300,000 in unused sick. It's nuts, but this happens. So how do you change it? Very hard to get elected officials to do it because the unions are so powerful. If it's in bankruptcy court, a judge can order these things. Or perhaps we get a control board. So now you're saying, Nassau has a control board. What are they doing? You're right. Nassau's control board stinks. They're political. They don't do much. In fact, the one big saving they had back in the Megano era, they froze wages for like 3 years. It saved them hundreds of millions of dollars. Great job, right? What'd they do? Megano had an election year. He gave it all back. And the weak control board allowed that to happen. So if you have a weak board, it does nothing. If you get a strong board, like they had in New York City in the 1970s, they saved the city and they did real restructuring. I actually proposed that Suffolk should have a control board. It's a good thing. Too many elected officials shy away. Oh, it's admitting defeat. No, it's not. It's giving you power to do things you ordinarily couldn't do. The county officials can't go to the union and say, we're just taking away all of those sick days. They can negotiate it, but nothing's for free. If you're going to get that from the union, you're going to have to give something back just as bad. But if you have a control board, you can now just get rid of those awful, horrible perks. You go to bankruptcy, you can get rid of it. And it's important that the unions start to give on this, because if they don't, and you do go into bankruptcy, then it's out of your hands. And in Detroit, pensioners took a haircut, okay, because they now lost control because it went to the judge. So if they're smart, they'd all give in a little bit now so you can accumulate those savings over time rather than leading to an implosion and a chaos, and then it really hits the fan. We can go to the next slide. Look at some of these salaries here. Village police. I mean, it's because we have mandatory arbitration. I don't mean to pick on the police and fire, but that's where you have mandatory arbitration and the salaries go so high, and that's where you have the pension built up the most. I mean, listen, you could have a public works employee for the county who worked for 30 years and never earned more than $50,000, and their pension's like 40 grand, 45 grand. They're not all swimming in it or living on the water in Lloyd Harbor, okay? It really does depend on which collective bargaining unit you're talking about. And the uniform unions tend to be the strongest, and that's why they have the perks. But look at these salaries for some of these villages that are sleepy. Their biggest thing is domestic disturbance once every few months. Some of these sleepy villages have like 10 calls a year for violent offenses, and the money is just crazy. We can go to the next one. Okay, here is a breakdown of all the different tiers. And a tier is the year in which you join public government. Okay, very few are left in tier one. That is if you joined before 1973. By the way, those perks were crazy, the first two tiers. By the third tier, there's new rules for the new people coming in, but that was for people who joined before 76. I'd say the majority are like tier 3 and 4, but they tried to do those changes with tier 6, but it's only, they're less than a third of all the members. And in the police and fire, it's about a quarter of all of them. So 3/4 are those who were hired before June 12th, and they still have those old overtime rules applying. Next slide, please. Solutions. Let's move one more. Here we go. Number one, let's support Mike Fitzpatrick, Assemblyman Fitzpatrick, and end overtime from being factored into the pensions for even current employees. Now, Mike's in the minority. We need a majority member and someone in the Senate to put this bill in. They're scared out of their wits from the unions, and there's very few guys with the guts like Mike who will do this. They need to hear from you. 2, install fiscal control boards. Suffolk County should be asking for it. 2 fantastic legislators in the county level, Rob Trotter, Anthony Piccirillo, have called for a control board. And again, you got a lot of these other guys, we'll lose control over patronage, or it'll make it look like we're failures. Baloney. You guys need the help because you're not going to do what you have to do yourselves. Next one. I think here we go. Limit overtime for each individual. That can be done. So if we can't prevent the overtime from being factored into the pension, at least let's pass something that says, all right, you're in your final 3 years, you're going to have a cap of no more than $20,000 in overtime that you can earn during that time. It's an indirect way of doing it, and it's something that's supported by a lot of fiscal think tanks out there, including the Manhattan Institute. Next one. Convert to a defined pension system. This is something Mike Fitzpatrick's been talking about for a long time. Listen, this should at least be done for new employees. If you're in the private sector and you still have a pension, God bless you. You're a very lucky person. If you have one and it hasn't been cut, you're even luckier. But in the public sector, and I'm one of them, you get these guaranteed payments that you get no matter what. So if there's a sharp decline in the market, in the pension fund, and 10 years worth of gains get wiped out in 10 weeks, taxpayers on the hook to make that back. You still get it all. If we go to a defined contribution system, you put in a little as the employee, the government matches it, and then it goes up and down in an IRA like everybody else does in the private sector. By the way, the good thing about that is it's portable. You can take it with you. You don't have to worry about vesting. It's yours forever. So there are advantages to that, but it would be very advantageous to our taxpayers as well. So those are the 4 things that our Center for Cost-Effective Government are pushing on right now. People ask me all the time, what can I do to help? You have to help educate your friends about this and push elected officials to do this. But you know what, this would really help? If newspapers would start paying attention to this and have follow-up. When Newsday wanted to get, that union provision off the books that protected police officers from having the complaints logged against them kept private, they wanted that gone, right? They just kept pounding on it and pounding on it. They listed every legislator. They called them up. How are you going to vote on this? They put their names in the paper. They embarrassed them. They made it happen. They can do that with this too, if they want to, if they have the will to do it. But there has to be that push from the media to focus on the right issue. That fellow Steve Malanga in his article was absolutely right. We're focusing on the wrong stuff. We're focusing on defund police. I'm a big believer in our police. The police are the good guys. The criminals are the bad guys. Support the police. We want more police. The way you get more police is to stop putting all the money into these pensions and these healthcare benefits. I'm a retiree. It's absolutely nuts. You know what I pay, what I contribute to my health insurance? 0. That's nuts. Now, if everybody had to pay 10%, it evens it out. At least new employees have to do that. But retirees don't, present employees don't. It's a system that's begging to fail. And we have to do something about it. That's what this presentation is all about. There's a few other things I can talk about, but rather than put everybody to sleep and just go on and on with a monologue, maybe I can extrapolate by expanding on some of your comments or questions. I see Rob Trotter is joining, of our heroes.
Okay. Ernie had posted that he had a question. So Ernie Fazio?
Yes, I'm here. Am I connecting?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Okay. Steve, one of the things that, I don't want you to get too nervous because I'm in league with you on a couple of things here. But
I'm changing.
Back in 2011, firemen in New York City worked so much overtime because of the World Trade debacle. And there was an institutional memory of all those firemen that was lost because that's when they were able to retire with a better pension. And they would not have been able to have as much money if they waited 5 years more. That this was the time to bail. So the New York City Fire Department was bereft of that institutional knowledge that makes firemen better at what they do. So that's another point you might want to make.
Well, we have early retirements all the time. In fact, a number of school districts right now are encouraging their older teachers to get out right now, and they give them an incentive, which would make sense because they're most vulnerable to COVID. You can get them off. The good thing about it is you get rid of that high salary. The bad thing about the early retirements is that they're now retiring earlier and they're collecting their pension for a longer period of time. It can work. They can be successful if they're done in a limited fashion. The county went crazy. I remember I was still a legislator in the late 90s. They were given early retirements like every year, and everybody would wait for the next early retirement. All they did was put out all these cash outs and then pay more and more people, on the retirement rolls. And what happens?
Steve, I'm not sure made my point clear. What you have is you have lieutenants and you have fire captains and you have seasoned firemen who have a knowledge of how to fight a fire.
Oh, yeah.
And now they've gone.
Knowledge. Yeah, but that happens every time there's an early retirement. And that's why I say if you have them sporadic, not too often, you can overcome that. Because they have people who are underlings who come in and then they grow into the institutional knowledge. If you're having them every year or every other year, then you're depleting yourself of all that knowledge. If you do it once every 7-10 years, that's something that they've been able to tolerate pretty easily.
Okay, I feel I've had my answer.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank Rob Trotter. I saw him on there. Rob's been a real champion. He's actually got the bill in to push for the control board. Sometimes he's like spitting into the wind, as is Mike Fitzpatrick on the state level. But he's got the right idea with that.
Okay,
Thanks,
Rob.
Steve. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that, it's not, the union's supposed to get as much as they possibly can for their members. It's the money they spend that it's fear with the politicians if they're going to spend, as they did against Anthony Piccarello, close to $1 million for a legislative seat, as they did against Mike Fitzpatrick, over $300,000 or $400,000 in his seat. And people are afraid of that.
Well, we should bring up your bill. Rob, again, he's got so much bravery, he and Anthony Piccarello. We all saw that some of the Black Lives Matters folks came out and said, hey, you elected officials are taking money from the police unions, and that's why you're keeping all of that, the complaints secret, et cetera. We demand that you stop taking money from the police unions on that issue. And so Rob is turning around and saying, Well, yeah, it shouldn't just be for that reason, and it shouldn't just be related to police. It should be anytime an elected official is voting on a contract. How can you vote on that contract if you took money from the person on the other side of the table? If it's in the private sector, it's illegal. In the public sector, it's perfectly fine. So it doesn't pertain just to police. It doesn't pertain, it should be for companies that do business with the county as well. And
Right.
Rob's got the bill in on that, where it goes.
Good. What's doing?
I put the bill in since I got elected. It's very simple. You can't prevent someone from taking money, but you can prevent them from voting on their contract. So if my brother-in-law got a contract to paint the bathroom in the H. Lee Dennison building, I would have to recuse myself because it's a relative. Yet I could take $1 million of campaign financing through super PACs or whatever, and then vote on their contract. Well, how is that rational? It makes no logical sense, and you see it every day. No one wants to vote against any contractor, with the exception of Legislator Piccarello and I, which we asked a very simple question to the county executive. What's your plan to pay for this contract? And you know what they said? Oh, that's not a fair question. Not a fair question. How in the this actually happened during the pandemic. They were approving contracts when our sales tax revenue is crashing. I mean, it's the fear I see amongst the politicians is staggering. They're afraid.
I had that bill in when I was a legislator in the 80s and 90s, went nowhere. Rob's trying to do it now. It's going nowhere, but it's funny because you had the Black Lives Matter people pushing these Democrats, and it's Republicans who do it too, but they were pushing mostly the Senate Democrats to stop taking the money. And I think it actually worked with some of them. So it's like, well, if you could do that with a police union, why can't you do that with all the unions? Why can't you do that with all the companies that do business with the county? You know, it'd be nice if we could take that to the next level, concentrate on where we have to concentrate.
You know, it's funny that Black Lives Matter, they were saying, oh, this state senator in Nassau took $30,000. They spent $350 against Anthony and against Mike, right? It's crazy. It's
$800,000 in the county executive campaign.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It is.
And where does the odd thing is, where does that money end up going? It goes to Democratic state senators who took over the board, who took over the Senate, and now are passing laws that are hurting the unions that gave them the money. They shot themselves in the foot. You know, and it's
clear. The ugly process is really bipartisan here. I mean, even you know, Rob and Anthony, they're minorities within their own Republican caucus. So the Democrats, the Republicans, they're all playing that same game. And you'd figure, well, there'd at least be some group out there that's fighting. No, it's incumbents versus non-incumbents, and incumbents just want to maintain their power, and they love that gravy train that keeps on coming. And it's not allowed in the private sector. Why is it allowed in the public sector? You know, we're in a minority on that.
because we make the laws. That's why.
Yeah.
They don't want to change it. And that's, you know, that's ultimately it's what drives people off Long Island. It's just too expensive, you know. And I don't blame the unions. I don't blame the cops at all. It's their job. Their job. But you know, I'm just going to keep chugging along and thank God for Anthony.
Speaking of Long Island, if you saw that Newsday article, and they did a great job on this, and I recommend everybody to go back. It was like 2 weeks ago on a Sunday. Front page, $2.1 billion obligation on the payouts, okay, the sick day payouts. You look at Long Island vis-a-vis the rest of the state, and it's mostly on Long Island that this happens. In fact, in the city, if you're a police officer or a firefighter, if you're sick, you use it or lose it. You have unlimited sick if you're really sick and you have a doctor's note and, hey, I can't get to work, I'm on disability, okay. But you don't get to bank your days. It's Long Island because the unions are so powerful. And we've had mandatory arbitration that applied to Nassau and Suffolk for all these years, which is why the costs are more here, astronomically more, which is why taxes here can be $15,000 without blinking an eye. And you go in other places around the country and they're $2,000. These are the reasons why. Right, Mike Fitzpatrick?
Indeed. I raised my hand. Can I jump in?
Please.
One of the everything shared with the audience, Steve, is spot on. And as you know, you and I have followed this for many, many years. What I think people need to understand is, in addition to some of the legislation that I've proposed to change some of this, to get this on the radar screen and force a discussion, I've also had a bill in for many, many years that I think needs to be done first before anything else will happen. And one of the problem we have is that the elected officials themselves enjoy the defined benefit pension platform. And it's for that reason you're not going to see movement on this. And I brought this up to Cuomo when I had an opportunity after he put the pay raise commission. Now we received a pay raise. They wanted to eliminate outside income. There was a lawsuit to fight that. That lawsuit prevailed somewhat, so members can still make outside income, but we get a $110,000 salary. But we also enjoy the benefit of a defined benefit pension. So when we got that pay raise, we didn't just get a pay raise, we got a really good pension sweetener as well. And this is why the public employee unions fight so hard against switching to a defined contribution platform, is because, one, at the end of every year, we get a plethora of pension sweetener bills, and a few of them pass, but the governor does not sign them, thankfully. But you're not going to see a change in behavior from legislators until you get us, first and foremost, out of the pension system. And I've advocated every elected official, from governor down to the town council, every elected official should have a pension system available, just not the defined benefit platform. And other states have done this. One state in particular, Utah, restructured its defined benefit plan, making it a little less generous because they have the same problems everyone else does. But they offered a defined contribution platform. So when a new person is hired in the state of Utah, they have a one-time choice, either the defined benefit or the defined contribution, and that's it. What's nice about that is if you are a new employee, a new elected official, you only have one option, and that's the defined contribution option. So where is my incentive? If I'm making $110,000, or in the case of New York City, where they make $148,000, and you're in a defined benefit pension platform, where is my incentive to say no to the alphabet soup of unions, even when it's fiscally irresponsible to vote in favor of something, but I have to take care of myself. So people are not going to do what's not in their own best interest. So you have to remove that incentive to be fiscally irresponsible, because the current system rewards that fiscal irresponsibility. And I said to Cuomo, I said, Governor, if you're going to remove outside income, you have to give us something that's fair, because it is expensive to live in New York, but take us out of the defined benefit platform and put us into the same platform that you proposed in Tier 6. And what people don't realize is that, did you know that the SUNY system, the State University of New York, offers both, but 70% of the instructional staff takes advantage of the defined contribution platform. One, because of portability, because there is a lot of movement in higher education. They all want to eventually, teach at Harvard someday, and they're able to take their account with them. But the other is the employer contribution is a little more generous than it would be, say, in the private sector, but it's still much less expensive for the employer than the traditional defined benefit plan. And if I might add, if you have a defined contribution platform in the public sector, it makes human resource management a lot easier. I can tell you, Steve knows this, and all the elected officials will get phone calls from people who are maybe going to get fired, or their employment's on the rocks because of their performance. And people will say, well, he's only a year away from vesting or a year away from retirement. Can we just leave him alone and just let him vest, and then he can move on? With the defined contribution platform, that issue goes away. You can get rid of bad apples without worrying about their political rabbis, stepping in.
And Mike, if I could interject, what's remarkable is
this
that
system going forward.
something as easy as that can't even get passed.
Let me jump in here too. There's a couple of questions that from the on group chat there, and one in particular. We have these problems that was put on by Dr. Lawrence Green. He says we have all these problems that never get solved because the same people stay in office forever. It is time for 2-term limits for everyone, not just the president. What do you say to that?
Well, yeah, let me jump in on that one, please, because that's what most people believe. The term limits will solve this problem. And if you like term limits, fine. You'll change the people, but you're not changing the system. Because Suffolk County already has term limits. It's 12 years, 6 2-year terms for the ledge, 3 4-year terms for the administrative positions, county exec, et cetera. And what happens is once you're elected, you're now incentivized to last at least 10 years, because that's when you vest. And then once you get those 12 years, okay, depending on your age, where do most people go when they term limit out? They don't go into the private sector. They run for something else, or they'll go and become a commissioner somewhere at a higher salary. They remain in the pension system. So that's why getting rid of the defined benefit platform, and I would go so far as to say not just electeds, but for political appointees as well, anyone non-union should not be in a defined benefit platform, because everybody thinks term limits are a solution. They change the faces. They do nothing to change the system. The system will remain, and these people laugh all the way to the bank. And I would use, when I would talk to Newsday, let me just conclude. When I would talk to Newsday, I would always use the example of Joe Mondello, because they hate the Nassau Republicans at Newsday. And Joe Mondello is the perfect example of the point I'm trying to make. 20 years as presiding supervisor, and because he's the county chairman, he gets to appoint himself to head OTB. He's there for 3 years at about $198,000, and now earns a pension of about $116,000. So if you term limited him out, he can still go to OTB, and he's still getting the big pension. I don't want to take any pensions away from people, but you have to go to a defined contribution at the very least for electeds. And then once that happens, you'll have a better chance. And also, I'll finish on this one. This is New York State. Nothing will happen in New York State unless we get the governor to get on board to want to move this, because that's key to the politics of New York State. Thank you.
All right, Murray had a question.
Yeah, so here's my question. We've heard the problems, but the solutions I'm hearing sound like wishful thinking that we've been hearing for decades. And the problem started years ago. People used bad judgment. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to negotiate with unions, so things have gotten worse. And now some people say, well, we need time limits on politicians, or we need to go from defined benefits to defined contribution. I never understood way back how somebody can go for defined benefit. How do you guarantee a defined benefit, even in private companies? You never know how much money you're going to be making. So defined benefit never sounded great, but made no sense. But the question is, what kind of a reasonable strategy can we come up with today that people who can do things can get on board with? From what I'm hearing is that nobody's going to allow you to switch from defined benefit to defined contribution. It's too good a deal. And probably the only thing that is working is making changes for new employees. That has been happening, I know, with the New York City teacher system. My wife retired from it, and they wanted to change the system, and Tier 1 used to be great. That doesn't exist anymore, but they have different tiers. But I'm not hearing any ideas, anything brand new where people who can do something are willing to do something. And by the way, Steve, I mean, it's about, you talk about Newsday and and the power they have. Yeah, you can say the media, but the problem is media is supposed to report the news. They're not supposed to be making the news. But that sounds like almost philosophical, because that's not true. But it's really up to people to get on board with this thing. And like I said, I'm hearing old news.
Okay, what's new though? I agree with you. I hear your frustration. No one's more frustrated than me and Mike Fitzpatrick, who've been singing this tune for 20 years, and Rob Trotter for the last 10. But here's what is new, and the control board. The best, quickest, most likely way to change all this garbage is through the control board. We're in a crisis right now. And if you ever had the need and the understanding as to why you would need a control board or bankruptcy, it's now. I don't bank on entrenched politicians changing this system. That's why I think you almost have to like try to start from scratch. And given the fact that these budgets are imploding, what McConnell said was right on, and he took a lot of flack for it. He said, you guys in these blue states have been yanking up the costs, irresponsible, writing checks you can't cash for 20, 30 years. The chickens have come home to roost. So before we're going to give you money to bail you out, not for coronavirus, but for the underlying structural imbalances, go bankrupt, restructure. Go to a control board. If we can apply the pressure for a control board to be implemented in our state, in our county, you can change everything in a flash. And it's the most likely way to happen because it gets the elected officials off the hook from having to make the tough decisions that they'll never make because they never want to tick off any of those special interests, the unions, et cetera. So you're right in your frustration that we've heard this all before. The one new thing is I'd say we're in a crisis. Use the crisis to get a control board or push these failing governments towards bankruptcy and start over. Easier said than done, but that's the way we got to go.
I'd like to bring up a point. The issues that we're talking about, whether it's pensions in the municipalities and the school districts or whatever the case is, we've been hearing a lot in regards to where the problems lie. And yes, they do lie within how old and long-term structure has been here for decades, if not centuries, since the whole system started. From my perspective, it's not a Republican or Democratic issue. It is just a process issue. If I know I can get into an office, whether it's on a school board or head of a school department or in the police department or a janitor at a school, and the system allows me to take advantage of these opportunities, then it's not whether I am politically in this thing, it's whether the system is corrupt. So yeah, you know, when I grew up, my family said, go out, get a good education, get a job. And at that point in time, if I got a job with IBM, Exxon, or whatever the case is, I was set. Today, if I had to go back, I would have gone into the Army, I would have gone into the reserves, I would have become a cop or somebody in the school system. And at the age of 40, I would have retired with 3 different pensions paying for me at the age of 40, and then go out and do whatever I want. So it's not a political issue, it's the problem with the system. So it doesn't matter who gets into office. We need a person who is in the office that sits down and says, I want to correct the problem. And you're right, why are certain states doing better or worse than us? And we look at our tax structure. Our tax structure is not only limited to what the state does, it's my school taxes, it's everything. And every single piece of that has to be changed on Long Island, because right now, just for me to have a Long Island address in New York State, I have to pay for that privilege, and my taxes are anywhere between 4 and 5 figures high, when if I went to another state, I'm paying less than $1,000. So where is the problem? And you're right, it is the pensions. It's a lot of draconian things that are in the system that are hurting us as individuals. And we need to stop thinking about it as a political thing versus an individual right to fairness.
Well, I have a book coming out called Solutions to Americans' Problems, as though I have all the solutions, but I'm at least going to spout my 2 cents about it. And one of the things I note is that it's no coincidence that the highest taxed places to live in are those states in which the municipal unions are strongest. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, California, Hawaii. Those places are just astronomically higher than other states. And the thing that they all have in common is that they have very free spending liberal legislatures coupled with this enormous strength of municipal unions who really become the tag wagging the dog. In these other places, you don't have that same kind of strength of those municipal unions. So you don't have overtime being baked into the pension. You don't have $300,000 cash outs for your sick days when you leave because the unions were never able to negotiate those crazy items into the contract. So when you say political, it depends how you define political. There is a political element in it, in that those states that are the most liberal in their spending, that have the strongest unions on the municipal level, are the ones where people are fleeing because they can't afford to live there anymore. And there has to be a balance. There has to be a proper balance, and it's kind of up here, and we got to get it right around there.
In New York State, it's all parties, the 2 major parties and all the minor parties. It is a nonpartisan issue. It's all the parties are equally guilty in creating this system. And it's only going to change through the political process. You know, if you go back to 1935 with the passage of the Wagner Act, FDR was vehemently opposed to the unionization of public employees because they will be hiring their own bosses. And that's what has happened. And that is why elected officials of any party find it there's no incentive to buck that system, especially when you're now compensated not only reasonably well, but also through the pension system itself. There's no incentive to buck that system.
And if you want to know how strong these unions are here in New York, taxpayers, you guys in this audience here today, are paying for the union leaders to not do their government job. So the guys who run the police union, the people who run the teachers unions, the people who run a lot of these other unions, they might have been hired to patrol the streets or to teach your kids. They're taken off that job, and your tax dollars go toward making them full-time lobbyists to lobby against you to raise your taxes higher. In Suffolk County alone, Rob Trotter will tell you, it's over $3 million of your taxpayer dollars that relieve these union leaders from their regular jobs so that they can have all their time dedicated to lobbying legislators to get them higher salaries and more perks. And in the meantime, you pay double because you have to fill that position for that person who's no longer patrolling the streets or in the classroom. You have to hire someone else. So it's a double whammy. This is what happens in New York. It's nuts. It has to change. But if people don't know about it, it will never change, which is why our center tries to get that out there.
That's been going on for 25 years, Steve. That's not something new. That's been going on for at least 25 years that I'm aware of.
Right. And we've got a lawsuit to try to change that, and we've lost on the lower level, and we're trying to appeal that. But sometimes it's like spitting into the wind, but we have to bring it up to let people know what's going on.
There was another question in regards to being accountable, and I also saw something about term limits here. So if the system is the way it is, all right, in order for a politician to become elected or become a member of the political system to represent us, there are a lot of things that are said. Your campaign, you're going to promise things to people and things of that nature. There was one question is, if a person is elected based on doing certain things and they fail to do those things, why can't they be accountable for it? How do we make our politicians be more accountable for actions they either take or don't take if our only resolve is to either elect them out of office or into office, and that's every whatever number of years it is based on their term, then we are kind of stuck with a person coming out and saying, I'm going to do everything for you. And then when I get into office, it's like, forget about it. We're just going to go with the status quo. How do we make that person accountable?
I could answer that very easily, and I'm living proof of it. I literally could vote for every contract and vote for everything, and none of my constituents would ever know. I could take all the money from the unions, live like a movie star, have 3 times as much money in my account. People don't know. They're not aware. I mean, one of the first questions I always ask people, constituents, when they call is, what does a Suffolk County cop make? 60,000, 100,000, 120. And then I say, well, my old partner made 287,000 last year. His pension's 183. He's 53 years old and he has health care for life. Is that affordable to anybody? No. I asked Budget Review to do an analysis. Since Steve Bellone has been in office, the cost of the police and his contracts that he negotiated has gone up 75%. Now, that includes pension benefits, which Steve spoke about, healthcare, and of course the increases. And look, that's their job, is to get that. If I would have retired today, my pension would be about double of what it is today, and it's only 6 years later. I mean, it really took off in the past few years, like Steve pointed out, that it's become, and this is an opportunity. I mean, it's an opportunity for Steve Bellone to say, coronavirus wrecked my whole, I was doing great. They actually had the nerve to come in front of the legislature, the guy from Budget Review, and said, oh, we had a surplus. They use fake terms that people only see the headline. That's all they see is, oh, we had a surplus. They're not telling you. A surplus in my mind is when my mortgage is paid and everything is paid and I have $10,000 left over at the end of the year. Not when I owe $5 billion and I have $3 million left over. But that's what they say. You watch, they're going to raid the Clean Water Fund. They're going to raid the Open Space Fund. And how they're going to sell it to the public is tax relief. Look, we don't have to raise your tax, because in 2014, that's exactly what they did. They put on the bill, we're going to borrow $10 million for open space, $20 million for water quality, and tax stabilization. What they didn't tell you was the tax stabilization was they took $200 million out of the Clean Water Fund, so they didn't have to raise your taxes. And now they don't want to pay it back. But no one knows that.
I want to.
Newsday has an obligation to report about it.
All right, Anthony.
Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just about holding politicians accountable. Hey, Steve. Hey, Mr. Dunwoody. Thank you for the question. I think the thing today that we have that maybe wasn't available to some of the older folks is social media. The way it's easier to hold elected officials accountable is to go on social media. You could do these live videos that me and Rob do once a month before every general meeting, where we say this is what's going to be voted on. I mean, if you look at the voting slips, you're going to see a lot of votes that are 16-2, and me and Rob are the only 2 people who vote against them. Sometimes it's 16-3 if we can pull another Republican over. And we're not voting no just because of an ideology, or we're voting no because the county is bankrupt, and we believe we have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers to hold the line on spending. But past that, they just put a bill in to move terms of office for legislators from 2 years to 4 years. I oppose the bill.
Stop that. Got to stop that.
Yeah, it's going to be on the ballot. So, I'm going to campaign against it. I don't think there should be 4-year terms for county legislators. It should be 2-year terms, just like Congress, because what they're trying to do right now is bake in this 10-8 majority that Democrats have, and the Republicans would do the same thing. I'm not trying to make this a partisan issue, but right now they have the majority and they want to bake in their 10-8 lead for 4 years instead of 2 years, so they can control the narrative of the legislature. So I think it's incumbent on, especially the Republicans who are the minority, but the voting public, to make sure that that ballot referendum fails, because I think every 2 years, and they made arguments that it's going to take money out of politics. I think that's a total false negative. I don't think it's going to take money out of politics. they'll just spend double every 4 years than what they would have spent in 2 years. So I don't think
This dovetails back to that other question about what happens when you elect somebody and they don't do what they said they were going to do. I think the implication was, should we have recall? I'm not a believer in recall. I think you need some flexibility as an official when you're in there to try to do the right thing and not be worried about the PBA or some other group trying to get you out after you just got in. But what Anthony said is right on. What you want to do is keep them as close to the people as possible every 2 years. You'll have your chance in 2 years to bounce them out. Don't let them get 4 years. If you're an executive, it's different. You're a supervisor, you're an executive, you need the administration to build. When you're a legislator, be it Congress, a state assembly member, or a county legislator, you cannot go beyond those 2 years, or then you really lose control over those elected officials. And term limits, look, I was the deciding vote to impose term limits. I'm for them. But as Mike said, it's not the answer, or you would have had it already in Suffolk where they have term limits. The better answer is the bill that Anthony and Rob have, which would ban the link between the elected officials who are voting and the special interests who give them money. You could run for 30 years in a row, as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. As long as you're not taking money from the unions and the companies where you're dealing with these issues on a daily basis. There's a conflict there. It's legal. There's nothing wrong with it ethically right now, but it should be made illegal.
There's a question by Jerry Siegler said, a honest politician is an oxymoron because everyone, even when one is basically honest, the cost of being elected requires favors. Do you agree with that, Rob?
I'm in the unique position that I won with no money from anybody doing business with the county. And the one guy who gave me money, he actually owned a grocery store and he wanted me to vote for the bag bill. I voted against it. It was the only conflict I thought I would have to recuse myself from, but because I voted against it, I didn't have to.
Yeah, I didn't take any campaign contributions from any public sector unions or anyone that does business with the county. So I don't owe anybody anything. So I get to vote the way I want to vote.
I consider, look, I'm a beneficiary of this. I have a pension. My wife's a teacher. So I have an obligation, I think, and I'll get elected probably every single time, to try to be the voice of reason. Maybe if I can pull them back a little bit from going over the edge, and I think I have in certain fees that they told me they want to institute these fees, and we didn't. You know, it's a lot. I think this is a unique opportunity, but you know, I don't want to squander it. I think that something should be done, but I think the county executive is very good at controlling the media and controlling the narrative. He's going to blame Corona. The first 4 or 5 years I heard about Sandy. Now I'm going to hear about the coronavirus. Oh, we're broke. Well, you're going to hear some numbers coming up in the near future about how maybe we're not that broke. And it's not as bad as everyone sees, but they're trying to get as much money out of the federal government as they possibly can.
So there was a question as far as, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Our contributions are all public record at the Board of Elections website. So I would encourage anyone, take a look at who contributes to your elected officials. You know, there are people, there are elected officials who are under tremendous pressure to raise as much money. And I've been doing this a long time, and I've always been known as a terrible fundraiser because I've never made that a priority for me. I've always believed if I did a good job, then people will vote for me. And I spend a lot of time outside the house, pre-corona, of course, but 3, 4, 5 nights a week, you're out of the house being visible and accessible to people. So not being a prolific fundraiser has cost me on more than one occasion an opportunity to run for higher office because the party leaders will say, well, you're not a good fundraiser. Well, that's okay. I don't mind being a bad fundraiser. I want to be known as a good public official, as a decent public official. But our contributions are all public record, and you know that transparency is a good thing. So people will support you, not because they want something from you, but also, and some people will do that for that reason, but they'll also support you because they believe in what you stand for and they want to support you.
Well, going back to that last question, the guy is frustrated, somewhat cynical. I understand it. But here's my solution. And it's somewhat counterintuitive, I guess you'd say, for someone like myself who's considered a fiscal conservative. But I'm a believer in public financing, and I always have been. And I'll give credit to the present legislature and executive for passing a public financing bill. It's supposed to kick in a few years down the road. I don't know how successful it's going to be, but if you do it right, and they didn't do it totally right because they left a big important chunk of it out, but the idea would be there's a certain amount of money that comes in through a pot, and it's taxpayer money, but you have to, as a result, agree to limit how much money you'll spend on that campaign. But if they had coupled it with part two, which they did not do, it's even better. And that is that if you take the public money, you must also agree not to take money from any union or company that does business with the county. And you can do the same thing on a state level. You can do the same thing on the town level. That might be it's not a panacea, but look at a guy like Anthony Piccarello, who's going to run for office, and he's going to get pounded from the police unions as he did before. So he's saying, oh my gosh, if I don't vote for this police union contract, they're going to kill me. Where am I going to get my money? If you have an untainted pot of money that you can go to get your message out, you're less held hostage. You're less inclined to have to go on your hands and knees to a party leader, to a union leader, or anyone else to get the money just to survive. You have an untainted pool of money that you can tap. And if you couple that with legislative candidates saying, okay, I'm taking this public money, I cannot take money from the unions and the companies, it's a whole different ballgame. So let's see how it plays out. They did half a loaf, not the other loaf, but it might give independent candidates the ability to get elected without having to go to the union or the party leaders. We'll see.
I agree with you, because I was always against it too, and then I started thinking, like, if we put $1 million in for the 18 legislative seats, and instead of the police contract that was $450 million, almost 3 times the cost of living,
Right.
and they only got a cost of living increase, that would save $250 million. So spending $1 million could save us $250 million. If that in fact happened, it would be worth it. Whether it will happen, I don't know. I think there is some features that say they can only match the money that's given to you from people inside your district. And you can limit how much you take from outside. But the super PACs throw all this out the window.
Yeah, well, I think to Mr. Dunwoody's point, though, we talk about all these outside influence, but it's the underlying system that's really broken. And we saw that in the last time I ran in 2019, after losing in a recount in 2017, I come back in 2019, and all of a sudden the minor party said, oh, we're going to endorse other people because they didn't want me to win to talk about these issues that Rob talks about. So we wound up having to OTB, this arcane system of running for office where you have to get signatures. You get signatures and your name still doesn't appear on the ballot. So I had to do that twice for the conservative and independence line, because at the end, they're all in it together. We're going to give, DCI to this person, RCI to this person, working family. They divvy up all the minor party lines. They divvy up all the campaign contributions, and they stack the legislatures to benefit, whoever's there at the time, whether it be public sector unions, a corporation, whoever it may be. And until we find more people to buck the system and go out and grab these minor party lines, if they still exist after this election, and really get in government and say, you know what, I'm going to vote whatever way I want to vote, and I'm not going to listen to anybody. That's the only way we're going to change that rot that's underneath that really poisons everybody. But, unfortunately, there's only about 2 of us right now, so we need about 4 or 5 more.
To that point,
Can I
Tony?
say something?
Actually, I was going to go ahead, Tony.
Can you tell us more about the control board implementation? How is it done? What are the next steps? What can the average citizen do? And what might LIASB do if that's the appropriate way to proceed?
Great question. And ultimately, it can be imposed by the governor, okay? And a governor is unlikely to do it without a request coming from the locals. I mean, it can happen. It's been done before. It's been imposed on them, as it was by a then governor in Nassau County when Galata was the county exec. But this is a case where the locals should want it because it will give them the tools they need to get control over the budget. You got Anthony and you got Rob who want it, but they're two guys. If organizations such as the LIASB, the LIA, the HIA, if there was a movement of all of these powerful groups calling upon the governor to impose the control board, the chances increase exponentially. You know, Rob writes an op-ed to Newsday on this. They ignore it. If you guys write an op-ed on this, maybe it's put in and it gains some steam. So if there was the ability of these different alphabet soup groups out there that started writing letters to first try to convince Balone and, you know, the locals to want it, but if they don't, it go to the governor and say, impose it, save us, maybe, you know, it can happen. But that's our savings grace. It's the control board.
All right, Mike, I'm sorry, Larry Green, Lawrence Green, you had a question.
Yeah, and I hate to sound cynical, but I think first of all, this has been an excellent program. I think part of the problem we're dealing with is that we have a very small number of active people. Most people, as long as they're working and they're living relatively normal lives, they don't really pay attention to anything. It strikes me that we're being bullied by very small numbers of people who then, you know, the rest of us sort of sit back, what do we do? What do we do? What's the mechanism of getting the sorts of large numbers that are needed to bring the state under control, getting them to say, you know, write to these people, write to the governor, write to the state senate, state assembly. I think that's really part of what's needed to get the ball rolling.
That's it in a nutshell. You just summed the whole thing up.
Well, it's like Rob said, you know, they don't know who's getting money from whom. It's so true because if you're an average taxpayer, you're out working for a living. Usually.
Right. And
You know, the unions and the special interests who come before the boards to beg for more money, they're paid by us to beg us for more money. It's outrageous. But this is the system we have now. The average person doesn't know. So why do I create a white paper called the pension time bomb? To at least start the ball rolling so people know what the problem is. They don't even know about this.
I think it's
have to educate people as to what the problem is. You have to mobilize them. It's really hard to mobilize because people have to work to earn the money to pay their crazy taxes. But we have to walk before we can run. We have to crawl before we can walk. And we're trying to get it out piece by piece. But you need a champion. You need a champion either in the media. You need a champion who's going to run for governor and say, here's my platform that I'm running on this mandate. You need a champion who's going to run for county executive and say, here's my platform that I'm going to run calling for a control board. We don't have that person. And we need a person like that who will run for governor and do that, run for county executive and say, I want a control board. I want to wipe all this garbage out. It's not easy to find that person.
I fully agree. I was a loudmouth civic leader for many years, and that's what I found, that we had a civic group of 1,200 homes, but it was those of us on the board of the Civic Association that would write to everybody and tell them, hey, this is important. We have a school budget coming up. We think it needs to have this and this and this. That's what got people motivated. And I agree. It seems that people, and I am a lifelong Republican conservative, that people that are working, they just, you know, we're not as effective as getting the crowds to show up and demonstrate for smaller government and much more efficient government. And I think that's what is needed going forward.
There's the old saying, when you have more people sitting on the cart than pushing the cart doesn't move. What do I mean by that? You have so many people now who are working for government, who are dependent on government, who are entrenched in government, that they are one class of people, and then you have another class of people who pay for it. And when those payers, those average everyday taxpayers, start to get outnumbered by the people who have a stake in maintaining the status quo, you're in trouble. And that's where we are in New York especially, but the entire country. You heard the saying, makers and takers, where you have now more takers than makers. Boy, it gets hard to change things when people say, oh, if you go to a control board, my ox might get gored. I kind of like these major disability payments I'm getting, so I don't have to go to work. I really like having retiree healthcare where I don't contribute a dime, okay? They don't want anything changed because they're benefiting. But there's a whole group of people out there who don't get any of that, who just go to work like these hardworking slobs, pay their taxes, and nobody listens to them. And we're at a crisis point, a tipping point here, where you're starting to get more people on that cart than pushing it. And boy, we better change this fast before you get to a point of no return. And that's why we're heading toward a crisis.
There was a question. Murray, you go ahead.
Now, one moment. One problem I think we have is that every time we hear about government talking about, spending billions of dollars, $80 billion, $100 billion, how much does an aircraft or a jet plane, or a fighter jet cost? Each one costs, hundreds of millions of dollars. That means nothing to the individual person because I'm not going to spend $100 million. And we're used to hearing that. It means nothing. On the other hand, when you have like an $80 billion problem, and maybe it's getting higher, and if you say, well, Murray, here's how much you're going to be paying more in taxes tomorrow and 2 years from now and so on, and how much less money you're going to have to live off of, that means something. So when we talk about we have an $80 billion crisis, I've heard that before. I can afford $80 billion. I can't afford that they're spending another $1,000 in taxes, though. And I think that's the problem with how we're making our arguments.
But one thing if I can add to this, it's really, and it may sound a little bit ridiculous, most people actually don't think that they pay taxes because it's withheld. They have withholding tax, and they get money in April as a refund. They actually believe that the government is paying them. That I think the connect of the government costs money for me, it's coming out of my pocket. I think that is one of the big disconnects.
Yeah, the other big disconnect is they realize that people got smart about, hey, I don't want my taxes raised. So now they implement the fees.
Yeah.
And that's where you're getting hit. The red light camera fee, the mortgage fee, the tax map ID fee, and on and on and on and on and on. And you wind up raising your tax over 1,000% with the fees, but they really didn't raise your tax. They say, oh, well, we haven't raised your general fund tax in 10 years, but they raised all the user fees, 1,000%. So they tricked the public into this myopic view of, oh, I didn't raise your taxes, but they really did raise your taxes. And Legislator Tron and I have been talking about this for a few years now. And look at what the courts have done. They've said the $30 administrative fee for the red light camera is unconstitutional. In Nassau County, the mortgage fee was ruled unconstitutional. So when these illegal fees are put into place, now the taxpayers are going to have to pay all this money back, but they're really only paying themselves back. It's a really sick game that gets played, unfortunately.
One example that we have in Nassau County is that people weren't paying attention, and now we have this real estate tax inequality where people who have been protesting their taxes for years, they automatically got reductions, and people who aren't paying attention, they are now paying the taxes for those other people. So you can live in a $2 million house and pay less tax than somebody who has a $500,000 house. So what happened when Newsday went and they exposed it? Now we're not talking about $80 billion and so on. All of a sudden, each individual is saying is, hey, I got screwed. And I got screwed by several $1,000s each year, okay? Then look what's happened. Now we're having an uproar. So the issue comes when you talk about, like I said before, such large amounts of money, you're talking to the masses. It means nothing. You got to talk to the individual. You got to tell the individual, here's what's costing you today. Here's what you will cost you or it's going to save you tomorrow if you do the right thing. That's what people understand. And I think that, that's the problem with the message. We're not addressing it on an individual basis.
On that note, I wonder if I could ask a naive question. I know that some of those folks on this call have had a rocky relationship with Newsday, but it seems to me that Steve's arguments are compelling. Why aren't these arguments publicized by Newsday? Why aren't they put forth and publicized to a great extent, so the average citizen can understand these issues? And I said that's a naive question, so I'll expect a learned answer.
Well, sometimes Newsday will just ignore issues that they don't agree with and they won't do. Other times, they will do an excellent job in exposing problems, as in with this sick day article the other day. It was very, very good. They've done it with the Long Island Railroad disability abuses, okay? But you've got to have the follow-up, was my point. It's not enough just to put up a front page article and then walk away from it, because the electeds who are scared of the unions, they'll say, hey, it's a one-day story, and the news cycle will change and people will forget about it, which is why you need that constant pounding and follow-up. Like I said earlier, when Newsday wanted that law change that kept secret the complaints against the police officers, they got it done. Not just them, but there was a big groundswell to do it. But they were calling legislators, they were putting their names up there, they were letting the public know, here's how these guys are voting. When they put up an article about, $2 billion in liability that we have for unused sick days, it goes away unless they follow up with a chart that they will publish. We contacted all of these state legislators, and here are the guys who said they will sponsor the bill to change it, and here are those guys and gals who will not. Unless you do that with the follow-up, it disappears. So Newsday's got to check, a mixed bag of history with this. Sometimes they will just totally flat out ignore real pressing issues. And other times they'll hit it right, but they won't do the follow-up. So, I wish we had more competition. When you had a Suffolk Life newspaper, which many of you might remember, boy, that put people on the dime on how they were going to vote, because that editor, Dave Wilmot, he was going to follow up in his editorials, and he scared the bejesus out of these legislators. That's gone. The media is so disjointed now. People, like young kids, are getting their news from their phone, from Facebook. It's not the same as it was, but that's why we need guys like Anthony, the younger guys, who know how to use Facebook and social media to our advantage. And, hopefully that there'll be these groups that will follow up and try to get things done. But it's not enough just to have a one-day article.
As Newsday's ad base has begun to shrink over the last few years, they've started to pay more attention to these fiscal issues. So, Newsday used to have a huge facility over on Broad Hollow Road, and now they've moved to much smaller quarters because they just don't have the ad revenue. So they've started to focus more on these fiscal issues as they've seen their own business opportunity shrink before their eyes.
All right, we're coming up to the last 10 minutes of our show here today. Any final thoughts or final questions?
I'd like to.
I would just simply say, Theodore Roosevelt said it's the duty of the free citizen to keep himself, or today himself or herself, informed. This is not hard to figure out. The information is there. We need to get people to it's in their own interest to keep themselves informed and to do a little extra work. And there are a lot of distractions that we all have every day with family and our occupation, but all of us have to, I think, dig a little deeper and become better informed. Things can change. I think, democracy is still the best form of government when you compare it to all the others. And we do need some adjustments here. But I do believe that because of this pandemic, that the dust has yet to settle. And when that dust settles, there is going to be real pressure on government at every level to restructure. So many jobs have disappeared. So many companies have disappeared. This morning, I just read, Brooks Brothers is filing for bankruptcy and closing stores, looking for a buyer. I mean, the famed Brooks Brothers, and Neiman Marcus, and so many others. This pandemic is going to have very real ramifications for how government is delivered in the future. And I look forward to being part of that because I want to try and steer it in a particular direction. But we've got to look at these structural cost drivers, and they need to be adjusted if we're going to have a future here on Long Island. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody to be on the call this morning. And I want to alert you to the fact that on Wednesday, July 15th, we have a restarting your business in COVID-19 times. And all the people that are here should, it's going to be a panel discussion. We have an accountant, we have a human resource person, and we have a real estate user on board. And I think we're going to get some very interesting comments regarding this. So July 15th, Wednesday morning, 8 to 10. I'd like to see all you people on. By the way, I've sent out information to a number of the politicians to attend these meetings, and I get back that they disconnected me, or they don't want to go on, they don't want to be on board with the organization. And also, I had a situation where a number of years ago we held a panel discussion, and asking the politicians that would attend, what is Albany doing regarding Long Island small business? And the only time we can get them on board is when it's here. They're going up for re-election. Then we get a whole bunch of people turned out. Other than that, we didn't get that many people turned out. So anyway, just leave you with those thoughts, okay?
I find it ironic that the four politicians who are like for reform are here and everyone else isn't. No one else is here.
Good one. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Just to let you know, the meeting was recorded. It will be posted with the others very soon on our website. So if you want to see it again, feel free to go to our website.
Steve, you did a nice job. Thank you, Steve.
Eleanor.
Yeah, great meeting.
Keep up the fight.
Keep up the fight.
Thank you.